It was only 5 minutes into my 34th birthday dinner when Grant Sutton picked up the cake plate with one hand and slammed it onto the polished floor of his own restaurant. Red velvet, icing, and broken sugar flowers burst across the tile around my heels, while the room went quiet enough for me to hear silverware stop moving. He looked at the mess, then at me, and let the silence sharpen before saying, "If you wanted a celebration that badly, Madeline, get down there and enjoy it." I stayed seated for one beat too long enough to see who was smiling and who was already pretending this had somehow become my fault. Judith Sutton leaned back with that dry, expensive smile she saved for charity dinners and funerals. Heather lifted her phone higher to keep filming, and Taryn Holt stood close enough to Grant that her shoulder nearly touched his sleeve. Nothing about her face read surprise, which told me more than the ruined cake. Because women who walk into an ambush by accident do not stand there looking relieved. Grant kept going because men like him always mistake a still face for surrender, and he lowered his voice just enough to make me lean into the insult. "You embarrassed me in front of people who matter," he said, jaw tight, eyes hot. "And I am done dragging dead weight through rooms I paid to enter." I looked past him at the dining room reflected in the dark glass, at Heather's phone pointed straight at me, at Taryn wearing the bracelet from last quarter's brand partnership budget. And I understood this was not anger. It was replacement. So I reached for my napkin, bent down just enough to wipe the frosting from my shoe, and stood without giving any of them the scene they had clearly prepared for. Heather's camera followed me. Judith's smile deepened. Grant waited for tears, but I only picked up my coat and let my eyes rest on each of them long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. By the time I walked out of that dining room, I was no longer thinking about my marriage, because the people laughing behind me had just mistaken the woman holding their structure together for someone they could publicly erase. I took the elevator up to the Lakeshore Drive penthouse without shaking, without replaying the dinner, and without looking at my reflection in the mirrored brass doors. When I stepped inside, I did not reach for wedding albums, framed vacations, or the soft lies people keep in drawers when they still hope memory can outrank evidence. I pulled a leather weekender from the top shelf, laid it open on the bed, and packed exactly what mattered. 3 days of clothes, my passport, my trust binders, and the operating files Grant had never once bothered to read. My phone lit up while I was zipping the bag, and his message arrived with the kind of confidence only a protected man can afford. "Don't come back tonight if you're going to sulk." A second message followed before I even locked the closet safe. "You embarrassed me enough for one evening, so stay out of my way and let adults handle tomorrow." I looked at those 2 lines, at the frosting still dried along the edge of my heel, and understood that Grant had walked out of that restaurant believing he had publicly reduced me to a wife with luggage instead of a woman with access. I carried the bag into my office, sat down at the walnut desk, and opened the encrypted folders that held the real skeleton of his polished little empire. I did not touch payroll. I did not drain accounts. And I did not break into anything that was not already under my legal authority. Because panic destroys precision, and precision was the only thing I intended to leave that house with. One by one, I removed my personal guarantee from the vendor bridge line, revoked authorized users from the household cards, suspended the auxiliary access tied to private dining memberships, and terminated the autopay structures that existed only because I had built them. By the time I finished, the silence inside the penthouse felt cleaner than it had in years, stripped of the low electrical hum of everyone else's appetites running through me. I booked a suite at a boutique hotel in the Loop, locked the last folder back into my case, and walked out without turning around because there was nothing sentimental left to rescue. I was not leaving my home in disgrace that night. I was leaving a failing system after removing the invisible support it had mistaken for weakness. By the time I checked into the hotel, Grant was probably still telling himself I handled numbers while he built the life people actually envied. That lie had worked for years because my work was designed to disappear behind polished wood. flattering press, and the kind of curated hospitality that makes debt look effortless. He was the face in magazine profiles and charity photos. But every clean line behind that image had passed through my hands before it ever reached the public. I was the one who separated the trademarks from the operating mess, housed the brand assets in a holding company, and licensed them back so one bad quarter could not swallow everything whole. I was the one who structured the vendor bridge agreements, the private dining memberships, the seasonal expansion terms, and the quiet protections that kept lenders calm when Grant confused ambition with reckless appetite. The flagship restaurant where he smashed my birthday cake did not even sit on the kind of foundation he imagined, because I had rebuilt that foundation 2 years earlier when the first cracks turned structural. The penthouse worked the same way, and that was the detail Grant had never respected enough to understand while signing whatever I placed in front of him to keep disaster delayed. When his first refinancing collapsed and the lenders started circling, I moved the residence into an LLC tied to my trust, cleaned the title path, and stopped the house from becoming collateral for his panic. He remembered the relief, the preserved address, the resumed dinners, and the return of his swagger, but not the page where control changed hands because survival bored him once it stopped hurting. Judith's country club lunches, Heather's rolling, content expenses, and Owen's habit of burying personal indulgence inside company-facing reimbursements all ran through systems I had either built or kept from collapsing. Even Taryn's polished little assent had rested on my infrastructure, right down to the bracelet I saw at dinner and the event budgets she kept routing through brand partnerships. They did not hate me because I was cold or difficult, and they did not try to erase me because I had failed them. They tried to erase me because every visible thing they used to measure their status existed only because I had made it hold. The first wave hit before sunrise, not with apology or shame, but with 3 denial alerts landing across my screen from systems still tied to my authority. Grant's household card failed at breakfast in River North. The executive hospitality card failed 2 minutes later, and Taryn's event card failed before 9. I looked at those red notifications, thought about the bracelet on her wrist beside my ruined cake, and understood she had gone to sleep expecting access. Grant called first, already out of patience, skipping remorse entirely because panic had burned through whatever charm he used when money still moved on command. "Whatever stunt you think this is, end it now," he pressed, then sharpened his tone and added, "You do not get to punish me over one difficult dinner." I saved the voicemail without answering, because the useful part was not his anger. It was hearing him reduce public humiliation. Filmed by Heather and staged beside Taryn. Into my overreaction. Owen came next with the smoother voice and the uglier intention, warning that any disruption on the eve of a transaction could expose me if I kept acting irrational. While he spoke, I opened the archived approvals and found Taryn exactly where I expected her, attached to reclassified expenses, hotel suites, private tastings, and travel disguised as brand expansion. Then I opened the email she had sent 6 weeks earlier. Cool and deliberate. Madeline cannot keep front-facing this brand if we want investors to see what comes next. That was when the shape of it stopped being an affair and became what it had always been. A plan to move me out and slide her in. I already had the Milwaukee suite invoice, the Aspen retreat booked as vendor cultivation, and the rail upgrade approved under executive outreach. All tied back to the same small circle of hands. Taryn was never an innocent woman standing too close to the wrong man, because romance does not leave an approval trail that clean. But replacement does, especially when it arrives budgeted, scheduled, copied, archived, forwarded, and signed by willing adults together. I was back at the penthouse before noon, not to reclaim comfort, but to meet them on the one piece of ground they still believed could be taken from me. I set my briefcase on the dining table, left the certified packets untouched beside it, and waited in the quiet that only exists before entitled people start breaking it. When the front door burst open, Grant came first with Owen tight behind him, And Judith and Heather followed, carrying outrage like it was legal authority. Judith did not stop to ask why I was there. Because women like her never ask questions when arrogance has already written the answer she prefers. She crossed straight to the coat closet, started yanking garments from their hangers, and flung wool and cashmere toward the marble entry while Heather raised her phone again. Grant closed distance fast, face hot, voice rough, and pushed. Give me the fobs. Get on your laptop and reverse everything before you turn this into something uglier. Owen stayed near the doorway with the smug restraint of a man who thinks the paperwork will always land on his side if he keeps speaking calmly enough. You have no leverage here. Madeline, he pressed, glancing at the room like possession had already become ownership. And if this keeps escalating, you will regret choosing emotion. I let them spend themselves completely. Let Judith keep throwing coats. Let Heather keep recording. And let Grant keep talking over everyone long enough to trap each threat inside Heather's own footage. Only when the noise broke into heavy breathing did I reach for the first packet and slide it across the glass toward Grant's hand. He barely looked down, but Owen did, and the color left his face before he touched the second page, where the licensing, termination, and occupancy notice sat clipped together. What is this? Grant bit out, but his voice had already changed. Because panic sounds different once a man sees county certification stamped above his own address. Then I gave him the second packet. The LLC management records tied to the penthouse title, the restructuring documents he signed during refinancing, and the page naming me controlling manager. Judith stopped moving first, one of my coats still hanging from her hand, while Heather lowered her phone half an inch for the first time all day. I stayed seated, looked at the four of them standing in the wreckage they had carried in themselves, and finally told the truth they had all lived on without understanding. You did not come here to throw me out. You came here to discover you were never the owners. By late afternoon, the first person to learn I had not ruined Judith's life was Judith herself, sitting in a private bank office with her gloves still on. She had walked in planning to pull money for Grant, then found months of transfers already gone, each one authorized under documents she signed during one of his family restructuring dinners. The manager turned the monitor toward her, showed the durable financial authorization, and Judith stared at her own signature long enough to understand I had not emptied anything. Her son had. Heather called me before Judith even left the branch, crying so hard, her words kept tangling, until one sentence finally landed clean. You have to fix this. Madeline. She has nothing. She pushed through tears, then reached for the family tone that used to work whenever they needed a mess handled quietly. I stood by the hotel window, listened to her break against the same panic she once filmed in me for content, and said nothing until her breathing turned ragged. Then I answered with the only evidence that mattered. Because the same phone Heather had used to record my humiliation now held their threats, their demands, and her own footage of Judith throwing my clothes. I told her I was not the one who taught Grant to use signatures like spare keys, and silence hit the line before she started crying harder. Softer now. Not for me, but for herself. When I ended the call, I did not feel triumphant or cruel, only steady, and that steadiness felt new enough to register like relief. Taryn came to my office building the next day, dressed like someone still betting on a version of the week that had already died. She stepped into my path and tried confidence first. Grant is closing this without you. But her face changed the second I handed her the printed expense sheet. The highlighted line tied her bracelet back to deferred service compensation. And when I quietly told her, "You are not wearing love, Taryn. You are wearing money that was never clean." Her hand moved to her wrist as if the diamonds had suddenly turned sharp. She did not argue after that, because betrayal can survive denial longer than paperwork can. She looked at the dates, the amounts, the approvals, then looked at me with the first real fear I had seen on her face. By the time she turned and walked away, Judith had learned who robbed her Heather had learned shame records both directions. And Taryn had learned planned replacements still get abandoned. The signing was scheduled for Friday morning in a glass boardroom above the Chicago River, where Grant arrived that day wearing confidence like it could still pass for ownership alone. Owen carried the transfer binder. Taryn sat 2 chairs from him in a cream suit she had chosen to look inevitable, and the buyers let them keep performing there silently. By then, the local trades had already run all week, Grant's planted story about visionary expansion, and he kept smiling, as if headlines were the same thing as rights now. When the final packet reached the center of the table, Grant uncapped his pen and told the room, "This closes an era for Sutton House for us tonight." Then I walked in with my counsel, set my portfolio beside their binder, and watched Grant's face change before he even understood why I was there in person. Owen stood halfway out of his chair. Taryn froze with one hand still resting on the unsigned deal, and Grant snapped, "You have no right to be here today now." I slid the first certified file to the lead buyer and said, "Before anyone buys a brand today, they should know who actually owns it before they sign." The top page showed the holding company structure, the federal trademark registrations, and the licensing chain proving Grant's operating entity had only ever rented my name in full. When the buyer turned to the revocation notice beneath it, Owen stopped pretending calm. Because unauthorized transfer language looks different when it carries your signature under Illinois law. Grant leaned forward so fast his chair scraped the floor and forced a laugh. Then pushed. "This is divorce theater. Not a business problem today to anyone listening." I opened the second file, placed the transfer timestamps beside the expense approvals, and told him the same thing the paper already had. "You cannot sell borrowed property legally." Taryn finally looked down instead of at Grant, because the page under her hand carried her own approvals for the trips, gifts, and staged investor dinners under review. The buyer's general counsel read in silence for another minute, closed Grant's binder, and turned to me with the only sentence in the room that mattered that morning. "We were never purchasing his restaurants," he said, calm enough to make the words land harder. "We were purchasing the protected brand assets you already control right now." Grant stared at the wire confirmation moving across the table toward me, and by the time security entered for him and Owen, the sale had already closed without him. 6 months later, I wake in a quieter home where nothing in the room depends on my exhaustion, my silence, or my willingness to keep translating disrespect into stability. The sale funds sit where they belong. The advisory firm has my name on the door, and every contract I sign now begins with ownership instead of apology. I do not spend my mornings checking whether Grant has lied again, whether Judith needs rescuing, or whether Heather is framing another crisis as family. The legal fallout kept moving without me having to chase it, because evidence travels farther than begging ever does once the right people start reading. Grant lost the company he thought his charm had built. Owen lost the authority he wore like intelligence, and Taryn disappeared the moment the invoices became louder than the fantasy. Judith was left to live inside the truth she had spent years mocking. And Heather finally learned that recording humiliation works both ways, when the footage survives longer than the excuse. What changed most was not the money, the title records, or the fact that people who dismissed me now lower their voices when they say my name. What changed was the reflex, the old one that made me step forward every time someone else created damage and expected my hands to become the floor beneath them. Healing did not make me softer, and it did not make me forget. It simply ended my willingness to stand underneath people determined to rise by stepping on my back. I still keep the hotel keycard from that first night in a drawer beside the first clean copy of the final sale wire. One reminds me what it felt like to leave without screaming, and the other reminds me what it costs people when they confuse my restraint with dependence. I did not rebuild by becoming harder to love. I rebuilt by refusing to disappear inside other people's ambition again. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for every woman who had to choose peace over performance. I hope it reminds you that calm is not weakness, and walking away can be the first honest step toward love. Tell me what healing looked like there.